I had been reading. I had been reading. I had been writing. I had been writing. I had been playing. I had been playing. I had been working. I had been working. I had been sleeping. I had been sleeping. I had been eating. I had been eating. I had been drinking. I had been drinking. I had been running. I had been running. I had been walking. I had been walking. I had been studying. I had been studying. You had been reading. You had been reading. You had been writing. You had been writing. You had been playing. You had been playing. You had been working. You had been working. You had been sleeping. You had been sleeping. You had been eating. You had been eating. You had been drinking. You had been drinking. You had been running. You had been running. You had been walking. You had been walking. You had been studying. You had been studying. He had been reading. He had been reading. He had been writing. He had been writing. He had been playing. He had been playing. He had been working. He had been working. He had been sleeping. He had been sleeping. He had been eating. He had been eating. He had been drinking. He had been drinking. He had been running. He had been running. He had been walking. He had been walking. He had been studying. He had been studying. She had been reading. She had been reading. She had been writing. She had been writing. She had been playing. She had been playing. She had been working. She had been working. She had been sleeping. She had been sleeping. She had been eating. She had been eating. She had been drinking. She had been drinking. She had been running. She had been running. She had been walking. She had been walking. She had been studying. She had been studying. We had been reading. We had been reading. We had been writing. We had been writing. We had been playing. We had been playing. We had been working. We had been working. We had been sleeping. We had been sleeping. We had been eating. We had been eating. We had been drinking. We had been drinking. We had been running. We had been running. We had been walking. We had been walking. We had been studying. We had been studying. They had been reading. They had been reading. They had been writing. They had been writing. They had been playing. They had been playing. They had been working. They had been working. They had been sleeping. They had been sleeping. They had been eating. They had been eating. They had been drinking. They had been drinking. They had been running. They had been running. They had been walking. They had been walking. They had been studying. They had been studying. I had been cleaning. I had been cleaning. You had been cleaning. You had been cleaning. He had been cleaning. He had been cleaning. She had been cleaning. She had been cleaning. We had been cleaning. We had been cleaning. They had been cleaning. They had been cleaning. I had been cooking. I had been cooking. You had been cooking. You had been cooking. He had been cooking. He had been cooking. She had been cooking. She had been cooking. We had been cooking. We had been cooking. They had been cooking. They had been cooking. I had been painting. 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 I You had been painting. You had been painting. He had been painting. He had been painting. She had been painting. She had been painting. We had been painting. We had been painting. They had been painting. They had been painting. I had been drawing. I had been drawing. You had been drawing. You had been drawing. He had been drawing. He had been drawing. She had been drawing. She had been drawing. We had been drawing. We had been drawing. They had been drawing. They had been drawing. I had been singing. I had been singing. You had been singing. You had been singing. He had been singing. He had been singing. She had been singing. She had been singing. We had been singing. We had been singing. They had been singing. They had been singing. I had been dancing. I had been dancing. You had been dancing. You had been dancing. He had been dancing. He had been dancing. She had been dancing. She had been dancing. We had been dancing. We had been dancing. They had been dancing. They had been dancing. I had been running. I had been running. You had been running. You had been running. He had been running. He had been running. She had been running. She had been running.